The Gospel of Luke 9:28-45. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen.
Weighed down with sleep, but still awake. And besides wondering why the disciples throughout the Gospels can't seem to manage wakefulness when they're with Jesus and Jesus is in prayer, I'm forced to admit that this state of mind catches my attention, and I've had moments like that. Those times when sleep won't come, when my mind won't be stilled, when nothing, not even prayer, seems to help. And so they're jarred from their not quite wakefulness. And Peter speaks up because that's Peter's thing. "Let's capture the moment," he says. So addled that he doesn't know what he's saying. Whatever else is going on here, the gospel is clear on this, that Peter and James and John are entirely out of their element. So of course they told no one. Who would believe them? They couldn't even trust their own eyes. But Jesus is in his element. In an attitude of prayer, he is transfigured. While at prayer, Jesus is most truly himself, in the presence of history and tradition. For that is what Elijah and Moses represent to the weary eyes of that trio of disciples. God's glory shines around him, through him. God's voice is heard in affirmation. This is who Jesus is, the one who brings heaven and earth together in harmony. No wonder they don't tell anyone in those days. Who would believe them? It's a moment of wonder and splendor, a moment where reality seems suspended. But in fact, this is reality. God's presence signifies reality. God's there, connecting time and space, the practical and the prophetic. That is reality as Jesus reveals it. And it should have jolted them immediately awake. But the difference between what they thought they knew and what they were seeing was just too much. And they remain, for the moment, captives of their insufficient imagination.
On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, A great crowd met him. Just then, a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly, a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It throws him into convulsions until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions, but Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father, and all were astounded at the greatness of God.
A sign. A sign is what is needed. A public happening, a miracle. And so, of course, the opportunity arises. And the desperate father tells Jesus that although he begged them, the disciples could not make this miracle happen. More evidence of insufficient imagination at work. Those who are attuned to the divine, like Jesus, for example, and, by the way, any of Jesus' supernatural opponents in the Gospels, the demon that possesses the child in this case, anyone who is attuned to the divine is sufficiently aware of the reality of God to be instantly affected. So the spirit that has the boy in its possession knows the truth and throws the boy to the ground, and the thrashing and the screaming begins. For in front of them is this nexus of the sacred and the secular, this embodiment of divine delight, Jesus of Nazareth, who will bring order to the chaos of this boy's existence, just as the primeval command separated darkness and light. The boy is made whole, and all the rest are astounded at the greatness of God. And in that moment, the crowd is convinced. This miracle has altered their imagination and has begun to mold it in the direction of God's intention, because that's what miracles are like. That's why we crave them and celebrate them and venerate them. Because we need things that remind us that not all is lost, that God is still God. And these days, we have to look much harder to find those things.
While everyone was amazed at all that he was doing, he said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands." But they did not understand this saying. Its meaning was concealed from them, so that they could not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying.
Jesus' words, which have for so long been a source of hope and wonder, become, in this moment for his disciples, a source of fear and dread. The words "betrayed into human hands" could not sink in. It is for the disciples unthinkable, in light of what they had just seen. In spite of having their imaginations momentarily liberated, Jesus' words made no sense. Because fear is an agent of imagination too, in the worst possible way. The journey that we're about to take through Lent, the journey from here to Jesus' arrest, crucifixion, and resurrection, is a collision of competing realities. The powerful and the prayerful, the certain and the merely curious, all of these are thrown together by the presence of Jesus. And along the way, in every case, fear dictates the response. Fear on the part of the religious authorities of being wrong. Fear on the part of the powerful of being diminished, of losing power, of coming in second best. Fear leads to a failure of imagination, which leads to despair, which leads to Good Friday. And we are not immune to these kinds of responses. Fear over the state of our finances often means that we cannot imagine that anyone has the ability to be generous. Fear about the increasing anger that wells up within us when we see something we can't imagine. That fear and our own anger means we can't imagine what an effective display of collective peacemaking might look like. Fear about the future means we are quick to forget that God is at the heart not only of our present circumstances, but of all our future endeavors as well. The disciples fear the reality of Jesus' words, and in their fear they cannot imagine that God will be able to do anything about it. Thanks be to God, they were wrong. It takes a lot. But their imaginations are rekindled when their teacher is raised from the dead. Their fears are vanquished by an empty tomb. And from that moment on, the future once again looks wide open, even though their problems are far from over. Faith relies on the best of our imaginative impulses. And we need that more than ever right now. So we continue to gather in worship and tell ourselves the things we need to believe. We will gather at Christ's table, and our imaginations will be refreshed as we meet our Lord in the ordinary elements of bread and wine. We will gather this afternoon for our congregational meeting, and our imaginations can be restored as we share the stories of joy and accomplishment that have come in spite of everything. And we will dream and plan for even more in spite of our fears. As we act in faith to banish fear. And we let our imaginations stretch and soar. And thus we are liberated from the ordinary things that would otherwise wear us down. And all because of Jesus, who dared to tell us the truth, who brings the holy to earth, who dares us to dream with God.